Good evening, and welcome to the American Antiquarian Society and our virtual and hybrid here in Antiquarian Hall public program, The Opening of the Protestant Mind with Mark Valeri. The American Antiquarian Society is located on the ancestral homelands of the Nipmuc tribal community, who remain an active presence here in central Massachusetts. I'm Scott Casper. I'm the president of the American Antiquarian Society. Our mission is to cultivate a deeper understanding of the American past, grounded in the primary sources that we've been collecting at the American Antiquarian Society since 1812. In addition to welcoming researchers from around the country, around the world, and right here in Worcester to use the collections, both physical and digital collections, we host programs like tonight's that are designed to provide insights into the past and perhaps also its relevance for our own day. Tonight's program is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel subsequently. And I'm delighted to welcome all of you who are here with us in Antiquarian Hall, as well as everybody who's watching on YouTube tonight. We thank you for joining us this evening. As a nonprofit organization, we welcome any support you might provide to help keep programs like this going. Thank you. I am now happy to introduce Mark Peterson, a member of the AAS Council, our governing board, who will introduce our speaker and join him in conversation later. Mark Peterson is the Edmund S. Morgan Professor of History at Yale University, and he's the author of several books, including The Price of Redemption, The Spiritual Economy of Puritan New England, which appeared in 1997, and most recently, The City-State of Boston, The Rise and Fall of an Atlantic Power, 1630 to 1865, which came out in 2019. He's currently at work on several books, one called The Long Crisis of the Constitution, the other Revolution's Ends, A History of the American Revolution for the 21st Century, as well as a third volume of his New England trilogy. It's a pleasure now to turn the program over to Mark Peterson to introduce our speaker and get us going.
All right, thank you very much, Scott, for that kind introduction, and welcome to everyone here this evening. It's my distinct pleasure and honor to introduce tonight's speaker, Mark Valeri. Mark is a historian of religion in early America and is the Reverend Priscilla Wood Neves Distinguished Professor of Religion and Politics and Professor of History by courtesy at Washington University in St. Louis. His PhD is from Princeton, and he has held long-term fellowships here at the American Antiquarian Society and the Huntington Library. He's the author of Heavenly Merchandise, How Religion Shaped Commerce in Puritan America, from Princeton University Press a few years back. He wrote a wonderful book about Joseph Bellamy, the new divinity preacher in Bethlehem, Connecticut. And he has just published this book, The Opening of the Protestant Mind, How Anglo-American Protestants Embraced Religious Liberty. He was elected to AAS membership in October of 1998, so he's been on the team for quite a long time. And finally, at the risk of raising the excitement level to truly unsustainable heights, let me just add that both Mark Valeri and I have won history prizes from the Presbyterian Historical Society. So, with that nearly unbeatable introduction, I give you Professor Mark Valeri.
Well, you can't beat the Presbyterian Historical Society. Before I begin the talk, I want to say a word about the images you're looking at, which have a lot to do with what I'm talking about, which is this comes from a book called The Religious Customs and Ceremonies of the World, published in the first English volume in 1733 in London. And it is by the engraver is Bernard Picart, who is a French Protestant exile in Amsterdam, doing engravings from picture books he'd gathered from around the world, and also hearing narratives and constructing pictures. And the left, your left, is a picture of the canonization ceremony in St. Peter's Basilica from 1712. the canonization ceremony, the Pope, who sits right in the middle, is making 12 new saints. They're canonizing 12 people. And you see that St. Peter's Basilica with the high ecclesiastical officials, cardinals and bishops sitting underneath, and then statues around the outside in a big domed vaulted ceiling. On the right, you have Picart's, I presume, half real, half imagined picture of what a Buddhist ceremony in Japan would have looked like in one of their spaces. And I put these two together to say that for these Western English-speaking, Bernard and Picart were French-speaking, but Anglo-centered, they had a lot of ties to England. For their perspective, they read the religions of the world through their own lenses. He constructs a Buddhist ceremony to look just like what took place in St. Peter's. You see the same vaulted arch ceiling, the same dropped canopy in the middle, with the statues on the side, the people gathered, and the divine figure, either the Pope or the Buddha, right in the middle. So it is to make a point, which is these writers had to imagine what the religions of the world were like, often through their own lenses of what they knew in person. I got into this topic because I was asking a different question than merely comparative religions, but I was asking the question, what was conversion like in the 1730s and 40s? Because there's a lot of conversion talk, the Great Awakening, the evangelical revivals, conversion is all in the atmosphere, so to speak, in New England and in parts of England. Did they ever talk about converting to a non-Christian religion or a non-Protestant religion? What did they think of converting? So it has to do with religious liberty, because you were really granting someone religious liberty if you gave them freedom to choose a completely different faith tradition, a completely different religion. So what did they think of converting from Protestantism or even from Christianity to a different tradition altogether? Could people do that? And how did they imagine that? That got me into the literature of comparative religions, or the religions of the world, from this period. And I was struck by two things. One is this literature is immense. Starting in 1653, there are tons of books and dictionaries, this came from one of them, of interest in what the different religions of the world were. I was struck by a second thing, which is my understanding in the past, before I began doing this project, was that when Anglophone Protestants spoke about non-Protestant religions, they did so pretty much in the same way from 1600 all the way through the mid-19th century. That other religions were superstitious, they were false, they were savage, they were misleading, they were deceptive, that all other religions were bad. And then that's the story. And I come from the discipline of religious studies, in which people who were very theoretically oriented, they've made that claim, that it's all the same. It's all especially about an imperial, racialized, Anglo-centric project to read everything else that's not English Protestant as inferior, top to bottom, the same way. All other religions are this mass of non-English, non-white deceptiveness. What I discovered when I read the literature, however, and this is like the one central point I would make, is that it wasn't one monolithic, unchanging Protestant mindset. The view and descriptions of other religions changed. That really surprised me. And so I'll give you an example of what I mean by that change. This is the first major dictionary book of world's religions published in English. The date here says 1696. That's a second edition. The first edition was 1653. by Alexander Ross, who was a chaplain to Charles I and a scholar, and he collected accounts from travelers' accounts that had been published previously, merchants who had spent some time on the shore of Japan and described Japanese ceremonies, people settling in Virginia and other parts of the Atlantic coast, people who had traded with Islamic merchants in the Levant, what we call today the Middle East, and they had written travelers' tales. Well, Ross took these tales that had been published and consolidated them in this book. The Greek word at the top is pansabia, which means all. Pan means all, and sabia is a Greek word that means forms of devotion. So all forms of devotion to view religions of the world. And let me give you a little bit of Ross's perspective that represents the 1653 version of this study of the world's religions. Ross said it would be impossible to imagine a country or a nation that did not have a singular religious identity. No good kingdom would do that. England is Protestant, and it's not only Protestant, it's Church of England Protestant. And it's not only Church of England Protestant, and he said, okay, I'll include some Presbyterians and independents as long as they're moderate and reasonable and we can deal with them. But he said that being the case, all non-Protestant religions are top to bottom one mass of idolatry and superstition. So you go through the book and you read, he goes by countries of the world, and as he describes the religious practices of those different countries, they're all bad. They're all foolish. They're all misled by priests. They're all filled with violence and inhumanity. He goes especially hard against indigenous American traditions. The phrase I want to use, and I say it advisedly, this is his image, not mine. These are savages who dance around the fire throwing, and I'm quoting here, deer's blood and tobacco on their stone altars. That's his impression of, and it's the same no matter where you go, from Canada down to Mexico and all through the northeastern seaboard. It's all one silly, foolish, primitive, that he didn't use that word, but non-cultured mass of religiosity. Now contrast this with if you will, the largest singular dictionary devoted to religion from the 18th century, 1742, by Thomas Broughton, who was a rector in Huntingdonshire, but it was a scholarly sort of guy. He translated Handel's oratorios into English, so he's a learned sort of person. And this is his dictionary, the title page from his historical dictionary of all religions from the creation of the world to the present time. And you'll notice it's not divided by nations. It's divided by topics within religion on the title page, meaning that he's not thinking of nations as having a religion and of religion having a nation, but of religion as something that crosses boundaries. And his very title organization here is actually influential on the French encyclopedist Diderot and d'Alembert, whose encyclopédie uses the same categorization for religion. The question is, what accounts for this difference? Because the frontispiece to Broughton's work, so this is the large picture at the front of the book, is a picture of two types of religion. Up at the top left, you see the idol of the golden calf on top of a pedestal. So that represents idolatry. And all of the big buildings in the background represent powerful religious idolatry. There's a Catholic cathedral, followed by Islamic mosque, followed by an Egyptian pyramid going left to right, and then a classical ancient image for paganism. In the middle, and on the lower left is what he thinks the the religions of the southern Asian subcontinent look like. He pictures, those are supposed to be what we would call today a Hindu ascetic on the lower left. Now, clearly he doesn't have a very close reading of them, but what's interesting to me about it is the three central figures are the heroic figures in this tableau. The person on the left holding the tablets is, so Judaism has its morally admirable tradition. The person in the middle is Mary, looks very devout, meditating on the cross, the cup of communion at her hands, with the Catholic Church under her feet. Those are images for a certain kind of Catholic prelate beneath. And then to your right of Mary is Ali, the founder of the Shiite Islamic Muslim school, with a copy of the Quran. And he stands with Mary and Moses as examples of good religion. There is a sense in which there is an appreciation that religious traditions can have their good parts and their bad parts, according to Broughton. And it's the beginning of opening up descriptions of other religions. When I first saw this, I was struck, like, I didn't know English people were complimentary towards a type of Islam in this period. So what explains the change from Ross, it's all bad, to Broughton? Well, let's slow down and take a close look and see what other religions have to offer. One of my thesis in the book is that this difference cannot be explained merely as enlightened skeptics like Voltaire or David Hume or Pierre Bayle sort of saying all religion is foolish and therefore we should be tolerant because they're all equally subjectively in error. Because Broughton was a Church of England priest, and most of the writers I talk about were devout Protestants. So I don't think that Enlightenment thesis that we sort of got enlightened in the mid-18th century counts for much. It certainly works in some ways, but not completely across the board. But this other thing I want to say is that I think politics explains it. I think what's happening in the politics of London. So this is by Nathaniel Crouch. It comes in 1683, and it's his portrait of the manner of the ancient Virginians, by which he means the indigenous people, the Algonquian-speaking people of the Virginia Tidewater, which is what he knew from English colonizers, in their worshiping of idols. So this is in that old Ross perspective of it's all bad. So you see in the center idol a devil. So idolatry has its the other idols. It's the golden golden calf from Exodus. In the middle pedestal, in the left pedestal is an Egyptian snake as an idol. What Crouch is saying is idolatry culminates in devil worship, which is about as bad as you can get for a twisting of religion and making it violent and inhumane, disorderly. But you might also notice something funny about this picture. What's that? What's odd about this picture of the ancient, the indigenous Algonquian-speaking peoples?
The costume.
Yeah, they're dressed as English people. And there's an English town in the upper left. And when Crouch comments on it, this is what he says. He's writing this in 1683. He says, over the last 40 years, England has been through civil wars. Parliamentary forces against royal forces that nearly destroyed the nation. And those civil wars and the violence and the riots, the rabbles, the crowds, the nearly England losing its hold in the Atlantic world because of this. That was partly caused by the fact that Parliament allowed the proliferation of different religions within England. they sort of lost track of controlling the religious scene. And so Crouch goes at great length to say, you've got these radical, crazy Protestants, Quaker-like people with divine inspirations, Muggletonians and fifth monarchists, crazy, ecstatically infused people, and they were allowed to proliferate, as well as crypto-Catholics moving back into England in the sort of decline of authority and control over affairs. So this is what Crouch is saying. Native American traditions are unruly and uncivil, and we know what unruly and civil things do to us because it nearly did it to us. It's a commentary on England. If England allows religions to proliferate and they allow non-Protestant religions a place within the culture of the kingdom, then we will lapse back into the chaos of the Civil War period, which he talked about a lot in his works. Thomas Hobbes, the political theorist, and even sort of mid-level diplomats, such as William Temple, who was a diplomat to the Netherlands in the period right after the Civil Wars, wrote this, paraphrasing like crazy. Nations are held together by common creeds or confessions. If you allow different religious traditions, the nation will fall apart. We will degenerate into rabble and arguments and faction and violence. So it is up to the leaders of nation to establish single religious groups, the Church of England in England, but also moderate Protestants along with it, Presbyterians and Independents, that can bring a stability and common worldview to the political order. That is the thinking of the 1650s, 1660s during the Restoration, and 1670s. John Ogilvie, and this is the last example from the old, I'll get us out of this depressing period in just a minute, a little bit. But Ogilvie is the royal cartographer to Charles II, and is a fine illustrator, and he published 2 big books on the cultures and religions of the world. And this is what he imagines to be a temple in what we call northern India today. So you can see the proliferation of divinities and statues and different gods, different traditions. The fire in the back, to the right, fire is always a bad image for these people who portray other religions. If there's fire there, it's bad. Algonquian peoples dancing around the fire. Back to the Buddhist temple I showed you at the beginning, there was a fire there. And here we have a fire in the middle of this Indian, so-called Indian temple. But people are dressed in different costumes. They're dressed in Indian dress, in Persian dress, in all sorts of cultured dresses. The central column, I had a hard time figuring out. Ogilvie describes it as a monument to the goddess Shiva. He's probably wrong about that. It was probably actually, those columns were in some temples in northern India, probably set up by Muslim rulers. So the Mughal Empire, which was largely Islamic in northern India in this period, Muslim leaders often set up columns like that. But no matter that he got it wrong, this is his point. Northern India was a political chaos. There were revolts against the Mughal leaders because they had stopped enforcing rules for religious conformity to Islam and allowed the proliferation of these different, what we call today Hindu sects. Hindu is not really an adequate term for the various northern parts of the culture in that. There's people at that time wouldn't say I'm a Hindu, they would say I'm a devotee of Shiva. But we can call it Hinduism for short. And what he said is the proliferation of Hinduism allowed the Mughal Empire to have revolts, civil war in northern India at the time. So you can see that these people are reading the religions of the world as all bad because they don't want England to lapse into chaos by allowing religious toleration to all these different sects and groups. What changes is the politics. 1688, I'm sure you know the story. There's a glorious revolution in England. James II, the last of the Stuart monarchs, is displaced. William III, a Dutch prince, is invited to take the throne. He has collateral relations with English aristocracy. He takes the throne. And William, there's a lot of English writers at the time, including William Burnet, a very well-known bishop, who write, political tracts in favor of William. And this is what they say about William. He's really good. We really want to support him. He's giving a lot of power to Parliament. He's big into liberty. We all want liberty, so he'll allow liberty of conscience, and we can form a coalition here. And he is establishing ties that will protect England throughout the world. He's establishing ties with merchants in the Levant, therefore Muslim merchants. He's establishing diplomatic alliances with Austria and Spain, which are Roman Catholic, and he's going to allow the private worship of Catholicism, private chapels, not huge public square sorts of things, but private. He will allow that, and his platform of toleration will bring all these other Protestant groups, Baptists, Quakers, Presbyterians, Independents, many of whom have voices in Parliament. They will get behind this policy of toleration, and therefore England will be strengthened and united by not a confessional oppression as Ross suggested, or Hobbes or Temple, but by the notion of the monarchy tolerating these different groups, therefore bringing all these different people together into an alliance. Not to mention that it will gain favor with the American colonies, places like Pennsylvania, where there's lots of Quakers, and Massachusetts, where there's lots of Puritan Congregationalist types. Will bring them in the fold and give them toleration. That political change continues the 1710s through the 1730s. The English crown is now headed by the new dynastic line, the Hanoverians, George I, George II, and this new imperial program of sort of taking the world for England, establishing networks and ties across the Atlantic world, across the whole world. More trade. The empire is based a lot on trade, also based on the attempt to make allies with indigenous American peoples in the battle against the French. And so the whole imperial ideology is a pluralistic empire that's bound together and protected by alliances with people from different cultures and different traditions. It's as though patriotism is now based not on a singular confession, but on the ability to tolerate people from different confessions. Some historians have described what emerges from this as what's called Whig moralism. Whig is the party name for the people who supported William III, the constitutional monarchy, the Hanoverians, and the new empire. W-H-I-G, capital W. Well, you see this journal, The Independent Whig, written by a combination of editors, but Gordon and Trenchard. I forgot Thomas Gordon and John Trenchard wrote this. And they wrote this is a very popular serial journal that came out, and they are the ones who say, England is not bound together by any religious creed. It's bound together by a series of moral virtues. Reasonableness, including the ability to self-critique. So they poke fun at themselves. You'll recognize the name Daniel Defoe, a popular writer who is in the same Whiggish camp. So self-critique, humor, sensibility, regard for the other, reasonableness, utility, being economically useful. All of these things bind together the kingdom. So the way to divide good religion from bad religion doesn't have anything to do with beliefs. about God or the afterlife or redemption or what have you, but dividing religions between those who sustain devotion to the common good, the liberty of parliament, the pluralistic empire, and bad religions oppose those things. So they begin to look at religions not as true good, close to Christianity, bad, away from Christianity, but which parts of religions seem to sustain the English imperial project with sensibility and reasonableness, including toleration. People like Gordon and Trenchard are especially distressed at the rise of faction in the English political scene. Angry, they call it party rage, is one of the phrases they use. Party rage, faction. People being disloyal to the monarchy or to parliament because of their own private political agendas. In this period, a group opposes the monarchy called the Jacobites. The Latin name for James, Jacobus. Jacobites are those who are very sorry that James II was deposed, and James had become, in the meantime, something of a crypto-Catholic. And so the Jacobites had Catholic sympathies. They wanted the Hanoverians gone. They wanted to reinstall Stuarts on the throne. They were supported by high Anglican churchmen called Tories, who didn't like this religious toleration, who described religious toleration as apostasy from true Christianity. And so there's this factional rage in the mind of the Whigs that's connected to a kind of religion that is into high ceremony, priestly power, a kind of over-emotionalism induced by ceremony in which priests, they don't like priests at all. The name priest they don't like. In which priests make bargains with political leaders that go something like this. I, priest, will tell the people that they ought to give you absolute authority, not parliamentary guided authority, but absolute authority. I will tell people to do that or they will go to hell. And in return for which the politicians say, and I will enforce your religious tradition in your priestly authority, or they will go to jail. This is not Valeri speaking, this is Gordon and Trenchard speaking, who say these sorts of things. So bad religions have to do with priests and power in this quid pro quo. Clearly, there's one church that manifests this more than any others in their mind, right? The Church of Rome. It's not just an anti-Catholic polemic because these people actually like some parts of Catholicism. They like Polish. For some reason, they have a great admiration for Polish Catholicism because the Catholic regime in Poland has very little power and therefore doesn't exercise any power, is very tolerant. They're very sympathetic with a large group of Catholics in France called the Jansenists, who are sort of the Protestants of French Catholicism. They're very scriptural, biblical, erudite, devout, and the Catholic Church is always trying to persecute them out of existence. Some French bishops defend them and support them, and other French bishops push against them. But so there's not really anti-Catholic as it's anti-institutional high papal Catholicism. This tradition that I've just talked about, Whig moralism, has political reasons to try to bind the empire together. And it comes out in this book of the religious customs and ceremonies of the world, from which the first two pictures on the title page were taken. This is a picture of the temple or mosque in Mecca, done by Bernard Picart. The Kaaba, the central monument in the middle of Mecca. All these devotees or pilgrims who have come into Mecca for their pilgrimage. And as Bernard tells the story, it's Frederick Bernard, he's the writer of the text, and Bernard Picart is the engraver, the artist. But as Bernard says, on their way to pilgrimage, they beat up anybody they see who's not a Muslim. So this is state power. It's Sunni, not Shia, not the Shia Islam of Ali from Broughton's title page, but this is Shia Islam from the heart of the Ottoman Empire, which is in Saudi Arabia at the time. It takes control over Saudi Arabia at the time. And you can see the massive space. It's very public. It's very dangerous. It's very powerful. But that's another image in this book for Islam. A mufti, highly admired. This picture was famous because people said, oh, Muslims are like that? This is lovely, gentle, pious, scriptural, learned, in a private space or scene or setting. So all throughout this dictionary, religions are divided this way. Good religion doesn't grab power, doesn't oppress, doesn't increase faction, doesn't grab, use violence, does not coerce. Same thing for Native American traditions. The central temple in what today we call Mexico City from the Aztec Empire bears a resemblance to the central square in Mecca, big public square, a dominating edifice in the middle, public, and on top of which actual human sacrifice takes place, according to Bernard, contrasted with this version of Algonquian religion, admirable, private. It's taken from a hut in the woods. Bernard describes English settlers coming upon this hut in the woods, and this very simple, peaceful, devout image there is a good sort of religion. I know I'm really late on time, so I'll push through. This is the cover, the frontispiece to Bernard and Picart's book, and I could do a lot with this, but I won't for time. But just one more image of the bottom row here is all about Islam, and you have the good Islamic teacher to be revered. And then on the right side, you have a bad version of Islam that condemns people to hellfire, the fires of hell on the bottom, and a camel who's garlanded for sacrifice. So sacrificial, priestly, ecstatic, ceremonial versions of religion are bad. Peaceful, learned versions of religion are good. Upper right-hand corner, French Jansenists are being persecuted by other Italian bishops, and there's a bunch of good Protestant heroes there: Martin Luther, John Calvin, Menno Simons, the creator of the so-called Mennonites, the mother of the church holding the Bible, a Franciscan friar closing the pages of the Bible, coercion. So, concluding. Number one, big point, there's change. There's not a singular Protestant essence of imperial, racialized bigotry. It differs and it changes, and we need to pay attention to those changes. Number two, the notion of religious persuasion and learnedness and argumentation begins to take hold in people's imagination, sensible exchanges across different peoples, travelers who tell tales of a wonderful encounter and exchange with people of different religious traditions emerges in the literature as a possibility. I'm not saying that all these people are modern, pluralistic, tolerant, liberal people. I'm saying they made moves in that direction, and we need to pay attention to those moves. I think the concept of religious liberty is under some stress in today's world from both the far political left and the far political right. And I think paying attention to these sorts of issues and these languages help us understand the value and importance of looking for change and places for hope. Okay, that's me. Thanks.
All right, very good. Thank you very much, Mark, for what I can say as a close reader of this book. Merely scratches the surface. You should all go out and buy several copies of it and read each one several times over because there's a great deal in here. And so what I propose to do over the next few minutes is ask a few questions that I've come up with from reading the book. The first one will definitely pick up on what Mark was just talking about. Maybe I'll toss out one that will introduce you all to some other aspects of the book, because just to take one example, there are two really powerful chapters here that give us a kind of before and after picture with respect to how this change that Mark is describing shaped the missionary efforts of English Protestants here in New England to indigenous peoples of New England. A hugely important part of the story here that you didn't have time to get into today. So that's what I'll do, and then from there we'll open it up to the audience for your questions as well. So, question number one, sir, comes directly out of the lovely talk that you just gave. That is, it has everything to do with what you describe as the rise and the change over the late 17th and into the middle of the 18th century of the central line in British Protestant thinking, emphasizing toleration, morality, politeness, and civility as its sort of prime, most valorized features. And what occurred to me as I was reading this was that the timing of that change is synchronous with what the American historian Richard Bushman called the refinement of America, and that many other historians have described as the rise of a culture of refinement, manners, self-presentation, discipline, and the consumption of goods that signify all of that. And things that you talk about in your book, like the rise of the Society for the Reformation of Manners in England, or things that I've written about, like institutions in Boston, copying those societies, creating their own, are all part of that. And so my question for you is, to what extent is your open, tolerant Protestantism and the Reformation of manners or refinement essentially congruent phenomena? Are they two sides of the same coin? And are they characteristic expressions of a burgeoning empire that's built on long-distance trade and these new consumer goods? Sir.
It's a wonderful question, and what comes to mind is the writings of Anthony Ashley Cooper, the third Earl of Shaftesbury. We just know him as Shaftesbury, and us historians. Shaftesbury said that refinement and politeness is a virtue of regard for the other person. That is, what we think of as superficial gestures are modes of communication that are very important for recognizing the other person. So it is a virtue in Shaftesbury's writing, who's influential on the Whig moralists. So you could say that the culture of refinement has its roots here in that culture of refinement is valorized, it's legitimated by some of this moral perspective. I think, however, that what Bushman talks about becomes very much embedded in class structures, economic class structures, so that refinement is only accessible to those who have the means to be refined. And that's where it slips from a common moral view into a socio-economic expression that goes beyond the imagination of the people at this time.
Fair enough, but I want to turn that back on you in a particular way.
Yes.
And it goes like this. The critique that you gave us, channeling Trenchard and Gordon and Picart and Broughton and these others,
right.
The critique of ceremonial Catholicism with its ornate finery, its mysterious objects and rituals, I would suggest is not a critique of finery or the objects, but rather of the exclusivity of those kinds of things, because the only person using those objects, controlling them, are the priests,
yes.
right, in front of an audience that is not supposed to understand the Latin, that is not going to be wearing the vestments, holding the objects and all. Whereas toleration, morality, politeness, civility are designed to widen the agency of ordinary believers in conjunction with a widening world of goods. After all, Luther calls for a priesthood of all believers, which means all believers are going to have to become more priest-like. So I'm wondering whether, to a certain extent, the sense of a widening world of goods is connected to a world of toleration, extension of these kinds of ideas of civility.
Well, yeah, that's a great statement, and someone who wrote The Price of Redemption would well make that statement.
Well, what about the author of Heavenly Merchandise? I hand it back to you.
But I will say that the exclusivity of high ceremony and ritual is true. The priest consolidates power in high ritual, and it is a performance that's done by people who are learned in doing the performance, and that does have a more exclusive feel to it, and the sort of spread of goods and opening up go hand in hand. I like that part of it.
Okay, to be continued.
Okay.
All right, now I'm going to toss out one more question, and then we can open it up for the audience. And this is a question about that part of the book that you didn't get to talk about today. That is the relationships of English missionaries with indigenous Americans and changing ideas about how you approach this. So the equivalent of the old way is the John Eliot praying Indian towns, where the idea is you completely change the ways of life of indigenous people, make them English, and then they can become Christian. Right. Versus an 18th century missionary, and he quotes people like David Brainerd, Jonathan Edwards, who are closer to saying, well, actually, no, the faith, the belief is enough, right? And they don't have to become like English to become Christian.
Right.
Okay. So here's the question that I want to ask you. And weirdly enough, it has to do with animals.
I'm curious.
Well, this is why I ask. What you quote Edwards as saying, among other things, is that moral reason that all human beings have is enough. And you quote, for instance, a sermon that Jonathan Edwards preaches to the Mohawks and the Mohicans at Stockbridge during his missionary years. And it's full of metaphors from nature that he thinks will be appealing about Christianity, about water and about plants growing and that sort of thing. But weirdly, he doesn't mention or use, as far as I could tell from your book, metaphors about animals. And at one point, you quote him as talking about how Indian religions have these sort of dark, mystical, animal-worshipping kinds of relationships. But here's the thing. Genesis, right, is the creation myth of a society of people who clearly for a long time had come to live with, use domesticated animals as absolutely central to their ways of life. And the Bible, therefore, is filled with cows and sheep and, right, I mean, and rules about them and all that kind of thing. And indigenous Americans, this is one of the enormous divisions between Europeans and indigenous Americans. Indigenous Americans did not use domesticated animals for labor, for work, for food, anything like that. Which isn't to say that their own creation myths or cosmologies aren't full of animals. They are, but not in the sense of dominion over them, right? But in terms of reciprocal relationships among them, right? So that indigenous peoples relate to beaver or moose or fish or whatever as moral agents, right? In ways that are not identical to European uses of animals. And so this may seem like a crazy question, but I wonder whether in this vision of a tolerant, open sense of, you know, you can choose your religion, you don't have to live like us, there isn't still the fact that by Edwards' time, the animal world of indigenous Americans has been overwhelmed by colonization, by the thousands of pigs and cows and horses and sheep and etc. that have transformed the New England landscape. So to say, well, it's a common moral sense that everyone has, is simply not seeing a different moral universe that, it's another way of asking, is religion in the sense that your Whig moralists, is that even a category that makes sense for the indigenous peoples that they're trying to speak to in
the
the
natural
17th,
world.
18th century America? Or their moral world, however you want to define that. I'd really be interested to hear what you think about that.
This,
I know I surprised you with this one.
you
but
did surprise me.
Yeah.
Profound. So I will say this, that in the language of missionaries and in the descriptions of North America by people who came from England to settle, make a distinction between husbandry, domesticated animals, and what they view as the wilds of North America, which they think is vicious and deadly. So Edwards does talk about one animal a lot, snakes and snake bites. Several of his sermons sort of say to his Mohican and Mohawk audiences, he had shared audiences. The Mohicans were native to the Stockbridge area, but Mohawks were coming down because of diplomatic matters, and so he was preaching to both. But what he would often say is, Christian faith is about resurrection and consolation. He doesn't talk a lot about hellfire and death awaiting those who don't believe. He talks about consolation and succor and relief from snake bites. And he's really big into snake bites. And so that's my... He does view the natural animal world, the non-husbandry animal world, as dangerous. There we go. It is all a den of vipers. That's right. I do think you're right, Howard. The overall point is that there's some part about their appeal to Native American moral conscience in which they say, our interlocutors, the people with whom we are Algonquian, Iroquoian speaking, whatever language they're using, that we're trying to communicate with them, these new style missionaries think that they're talking with people who have the same moral conscience that they do. And they're not aware of the complete world of the moral conscience of those people. I agree with you on that. I do think that they're operating with the confidence that shared moral conscience is a bridge that creates affability, comradeship, etc. Mm-hmm. But I think you're right. They cannot comprehend what you talked about.
Yeah,
it's a good
a corner that can't be turned. Yeah,
I think that's right.
Right. Well, look, I could spend the rest of the evening asking Mark more questions about this wonderful book, but let me now open it up to the audience and see if you have questions that you would like to follow up with. Dan is waiting there with microphone in hand, so be not shy.
Yeah, hi, thank you. So I was wondering what you think the effect on the like, for example, the French Wars of Religion had on all of this, because I read Michel de Montaigne's essays on cannibalism, right? And that was like, oh man, that was like really like deep into like David Hume and this moral relativism, and like comparing, like saying like, we looked up on the cannibals, but but we believe that when we have communion, we literally drink the blood of Christ and eat his flesh. So who are we to judge? So what do you think that the French that all had effect on this right here?
The first point to say is the French Wars of Religion, 1580s to, my dates are a little loosey-goosey, but 1580s through 1610s or something like that, 1590s maybe. But the French Wars of Religion are very violent, very destructive, and there are stories of Catholic vigilantes going after Protestants and cutting them open and pulling out their organs and throwing them away and things like that. And Montaigne is saying that there's all kinds of cannibalism, and so we should not make fun, or we should not deprecate the cannibalism that French explorers discovered initially in Brazil. We should not deprecate those, because we Europeans have a worse form of cannibalism. Native peoples, and he's speaking of the Tupinamba people of Brazil, they kill people first and then eat them. We eat people alive. We Europeans eat people alive. So I think that kind of literature it's in the background to some of the self-critique that the 18th century English colonizers have. That we are, in fact, indigenous peoples are certainly our moral equals. Edwards actually almost used that language. They are our moral equals. He uses more theological terms for it, but he does. So I think that's a little bit in the background. It's a good point. Yeah.
Thank you for an excellent talk, but very, very interesting. My question is centered on Massachusetts, what we're saying today. As you well know, John Adams wrote our Constitution, and in the Constitution is an explicit banishment of Catholics from ever holding the office of governor. The Congregationalist Church was an established church in Massachusetts until the 1830s. You had to pay the support of the church unless you were a Baptist. You can get a license not to, but everyone else had to do it. So I guess my question to you is, how does that those facts fit into with your thesis about the opening of the Protestant mind? Because that doesn't seem very open-minded to me.
Bravo. And here's my response to it, that I think the politics leads, and the American Revolution creates a very different political situation. It creates a desire for conquest of North America. And that creates different attitudes, especially towards indigenous religious traditions. So it becomes, after American independence, it becomes explicitly racialized in ways that weren't in the mid-18th century. And it has to do with America's desire for westward expansion and conquest. And the consolidation of Protestant power in Massachusetts in this period is clear to me, and I don't quite fully understand it. I don't think it's compatible with what I've been talking about, but I think it has to do with the shift of the making of the American nation. And my colleague here has a lot to say about this in his book on Boston. That has its own boomerang effects on liberty.
Well, I would just quickly add that essentially in Massachusetts from 1691 forward, the Second Charter era, the version of toleration that is declared in England by Parliament is essentially the version that Massachusetts has as well, with the difference being that the established church in Massachusetts is the Congregational Church rather than the established church. But in both cases, all Protestants are tolerated. And so there wasn't that big a change with the 1780 Constitution. That is, what it required was that everyone in Massachusetts pay taxes to support the established church in their town. It just so happened that in virtually every town in Massachusetts, that was the Congregational Church. But anybody could not pay that and instead put their money towards religion of their choice. That was often difficult given how few of their fellow religionists there might be in this, that, or the other town. But it was actually, structurally congruent with that in England. It's just that Massachusetts was a curiosity in the Anglo-American world in being so relatively uniformly devoted to a single strain of the English Protestant world, right?
Yes, and the preamble or preface to the Massachusetts State Constitution, written during the Revolution, guarantees freedom of religious conscience. I mean, it's very kind of progressive, forward-looking, but when you get to laying out the rule, it assumes that that is congruent with state support for these religious institutions.
Right, because it also argues that that religious education is essential to the maintenance of Republican government.
Right.
It stakes out that position.
All right, Mark.
Hi,
I get
Nina.
to ask a question. Hi.
Uh-oh.
No, I wondered if you'd reflect on your beautiful book as history of the book. I'm just something as history of the book. You know, as a field, the history of the book, the history of reading, right? The history of books. And your slide certainly stressed key books that you analyze. You know, and a second question related to that is, I was just thinking, over the sweep of time that you cover, I'm just wondering how much you think other books about parts of the world, about the Americas, are changing or, you know, influencing your authors in the latter period versus the early.
That's really good. So my only explicit reflections on the history of the book that come to mind right away are the importance of images and the importance of images for introducing people to different, you know, cultures in different parts of the world and practices in different parts of the world. That's what struck me when I encountered these dictionaries, is these images. I don't know if that's been written into the history of the book's history so much, but that's what strikes me about this, is to include much more on the use of imagery. Not maps. There's been a lot written about maps, but this kind of imagery in the history of it strike me as very crucial. It also strikes me that these books become middle-class markers of civility and gentility. That people talk about having their geographies or their dictionaries as part of their household libraries. They might have 10 books in their household. One of them's a Bible, maybe a couple children's books, and a dictionary of world cultures or some often appears. Yeah. Thanks.
My understanding is the India Company was a big deal. How about India, and how does this influence you talked about trade, and India's was too big to colonize in the same way the states are?
Well, number one is English merchants are competing with Dutch merchants and especially French military power until the end of the 7 Years' War in India. And so they're sort of latecomers to the South Asian subcontinent. And when they come there, they already have established European contacts and people with which to deal. It is not until the 19th century that India, if you will, becomes a full-fledged English colony. You want to add to that?
No, but I mean, in other words, Mark's story comes to a conclusion before the major thrust of the of Britain's South Asian colonial project.
Exactly,
so it's,
exactly.
Yeah. And I don't know what the answer would be if you were to take it onward.
Neither do I.
That seems a very good moment at which to thank Mark Valeri and Mark Peterson for this conversation. I also want to thank those of you who are with us tonight, whether you are in this room at Antiquarian Hall or with us in the YouTube room. If you'd like to recommend this program to friends, it will be available on our YouTube channel in the coming days. We have a full slate of programs over the coming months. In fact, a program almost every week between now and the end of April. I'll mention just a few. Next Thursday, February 29th at 2 p.m., Martha Cutter will talk about her book, The Many Resurrections of Henry Box Brown. That's a virtual program. The following week, March 5th at 7 p.m., we have a hybrid program here in Antiquarian Hall and live streaming in which Leslie Butler will talk about her book, Consistent Democracy, The Woman Question and Self-Government in 19th Century America. And for something quite different, in a virtual program on March 14th, Hannah Carlson will be talking about her book, Pockets, An Intimate History of How We Keep Things Close. That is the joy of the American Antiquarian Society. Our collections and our mission embrace all of these different stories of the American past, and we welcome you to join us for as many of them as you possibly can. For more on the upcoming programs, please do check out our website, AmericanAntiquarian.org. For now, thank you and have a good evening.